Guys, so you guys might remember that just the other day we swatched some Sailor Storia inks, and if you give me just a second, I think I can grab that swatch for you. But anyway, I went ahead and I penciled and inked a piece because I filled my Noodler's Ahab with Storia and Lion, and I'm just going to unscrew to show you guys how it looks in the piston. So you see, I have a piston full of Lion, and previously I'd had some platinum carbon black ink in there, and that is sort of that grungy looking layer back there. I didn't want to fill it with a translucent ink that you might really notice if there was some grunge, so I thought Lion was a perfect opportunity. And I have to say that the Ahab that I have, in conjunction with Sailor Storia pigment ink, is just a beautiful, highly recommended combination for my artist friends who are interested in fountain pens. I might even have to try it out in my modified Jinhao. This was inked last night and I allowed it to dry. I'm going to go ahead and erase, and then I want to watercolor over it and see, because, okay, so as the swatch test showed, and I don't know where that swatch ran away to, but as the swatch test showed, Storia in Lion and in Dancer is water resistant but not entirely waterproof. So I want to see how well I can watercolor over Storia and how much it's going to smudge. And I erased all the graphite from underneath my sketch. You can still see a little bit of it, but I don't think it's a distracting amount, and it erases pretty cleanly, leaving pretty much just the light brown. So I'm going to check in with you guys sort of at the beginning of when I'm watercoloring this, and then at the end. Guys and gals, cats and kittens, today we are going to start playing around with this line art that I inked. I'm just preparing my watercolor right now, and this was inked, like I said earlier in the video, using Sailor Storia ink. This is a pigment ink. I used Lion. And my Noodler's Ahab, which has a creeper nib, which is a flexible nib that I recommend that if you're an artist who's on the fence about maybe using fountain pens, you give that a shot. So the first thing we're going to do is an overall wash, which will be a good indicator for water fastness. And I'm going to go ahead and use a small clip to secure my painting down, because this is very thin paper. This is Holbein sketchbook paper, or watercolor sketch paper. So it's very thin paper. It's really more like a card, but it works fine. And I'm going to actually start with a wash of very light Indian yellow, something very sunny, because Lion and the way Lion shades really reminded me of Indian yellow. So I'm using a flat synthetic brush, and I'm just going to go ahead and do an all-over wash, sort of just establish my line, and then I'm going to soak up any excess watercolor. Trying to work around the clip without it being too obvious. And if you enjoy my watercolor, you should definitely check out my watercolor playlist. I've been doing loads of super helpful tutorials designed to get you guys painting. So it's a very basic wash. I notice no significant color migration. I'm going to leave her face the way it is since it's going to dry lighter. I'm going to add a little more Indian yellow, and I'm just going to, first of all, I'm going to prop this up because everything seems to want to tilt in the direction of her head. So I'm going to prop that up just a little bit and darken, add a little extra Indian yellow to some areas just to brighten the picture up a little bit. Then I'm going to, actually I can do that into her hair, it's not a big deal. Here we go. Alright, so I'm actually just going to go ahead and use my Noodler's pen to prop this up. But as you can see, or maybe you can't see it super well, but you should trust me when I tell you, there is no significant color migration with the Storia, which means I think it will hold up pretty well if you want to do light watercolor work. So as you guys can see, the paper has already started curling up. If you are going to ink your watercolor pieces with a fountain pen, I recommend you actually stay away from the nicer papers, the cotton rag papers. The inks sometimes don't bond with those papers the way other waterproof inks might, and they can also get caught up in the tines of your nib. So a cellulose-based paper like the one here, or Montval, or I forgot the brand name, the one who makes the Beta, Delta, Theta sketchbooks, or Strathmore watercolor paper. Any of those less expensive watercolor papers are actually going to be a better choice if you want to do fountain pen sketches and then watercolor. I'm going in with just a little bit more of that sunny Indian yellow. And in order to get smaller details, I'm holding my flat at an angle. And the thing you see me picking my paint up from, that is an Ink Essentials craft mat. So basically, if you have any impermeable sort of craft mat or craft surface, or even if you wanted to use some like some scrap plastic as a palette, that would work fine. You don't have to use a weld palette if you don't want to. I'm doing some little sort of swishy, kind of dry, I went in a little wet there, brush strokes to sort of give like a sun dappled appearance. Some areas I'm going to dab a little extra of the Indian yellow in. And I'm going to let this dry, but I'm going to go ahead and activate a scarlet and a yellow ochre, because I like to use those for lighter skin tones. So that background has had a chance to dry. I'm going to go ahead now and mix up that skin tone that we just talked about. And I'm just going to do it here on my craft mat. And I heard another artist the other day on YouTube talking about making puddles. I usually work in weld palettes, so I'd never really heard of it referred to as puddles, but I guess it is a puddle. Just hadn't heard of it that way. Go ahead and add a little bit more of that. And I'm using a round. It is a 4 round. It is a Creative Mark Rhapsody, which is a Jerry's Artorama Kolinsky Sable brush. They're pretty affordable. Definitely cheaper than the Series 7s, which tend to be sort of the watercolor and inkist, or that used to be the watercolorist and inkist's holy grail. Kolinsky Sable is one of the nicest natural fibers you can use for your watercolors. And the Creative Marks are quite affordable. For this size, I probably could have filled this in with a 6, but I do have some fairly small areas that are a little challenging to work around, so the 4 is a little bit better of a choice in that regard. and I'm pretty much just doing a fill, although I will leave some area of white here on her shoulder, and I'm going to allow this to dry before I do another layer on top of that. And I have still not noticed any pigment lifting up, any streaking, any smearing, so no noticeable problems with the Storia ink in Lion. So that first layer has had a chance to dry. I'm going to go on in now with a second layer. And it's still that mixture of yellow ochre with a little bit of scarlet mixed in. Scarlet hue will also work. Scarlet Lake, any of those is usually fine. And I mean, from a painting perspective, I'm being a little sloppy. I'm having a little bit of a hard time tonight with this paper. But I can clean that up after this is dried. And I will do that. But that's not a flaw in the ink. That is a flaw in the artist. While this was drying, I went ahead and I got a cup of fresh, clean water. And I am going to go ahead and create another little puddle. It has some glue already or still in the brush, which is not good. And I'm going to grab a little bit of Payne's Gray. And a little bit of purple. And that's going to be the basis for my shadow color. That's usually how I color whites, is with a shadow color. I'm going to go ahead now and fill most of that in. This is also a cheap Jerry's brush, except it's got very sharp bits on it. That can cut your hand if you're not careful. And I am leaving, since this is supposed to be a shadow color of the white, I'm leaving an edge uncolored to indicate that the light is hitting that. Of course, I am also going to need to go in and clean up some of that skin tone that did get a little bit over the border. So, to do that, I'm going to use a clean brush. Actually, I want something a little scrubbier than that. I'm going to use a clean brush, slightly dampened, not too wet, and I'm just going to scrub it over the area and I'm going to use a little bit of paper towel to clean that up. So that's really pretty simple. And while this is wet, I'm going to use my quill, mix that over here, another area, and I'm going to add that slightly darker shadow color while the paper is wet so that it'll sort of diffuse into the rest of the color. This is slightly less wet. It's not going to work quite as well. I'm going to have to go back over that with a wet brush and blend it out a little bit perhaps. I don't want to blend all of it out because I do like some of those harsher lines. And I will dab out the excess water, making this a thirsty brush. And I'm going to extend some of that out. And now, using that 4, I am going to add some shading to her eyes. So basically we're shading the whites of her eyes and her teeth, and I'm going to start shading the straps of her dress. And then again, using a thirsty brush, I'm going to just pick up that excess color and step away, I think, or maybe really quick. Go. Nope, step away, because that's not going to work. Alright, so I'm going to let that dry and I'll be back. Guys, so both of those layers have dried. I'm going to go ahead and work on darkening up her dress just a little bit. And I'm also going to go ahead and mix up the base color for her hair and her eyes. So I'm making a fairly large puddle on my ink stencil sheet. So going to go ahead and activate Venetian Red. So I've, sorry about that. So I've got the base of her hair colored in. Going to go back in now, again with that skin color, which has had some time to evaporate, and thus intensifying color a little bit, condensing color. And I'm just going to add shadows here and there, and I'm going to try to avoid any large wet areas. And once her hair dries, I'm going to use what's left to go back in and add a shadow underneath her bangs. Okay, so my watercolor has had a chance to dry, and I'd let it dry in the brush, in fact, because I didn't want to risk losing the color that I'd mixed. And I'm going to, hopefully this will be dark enough, go ahead and darken where the bangs would have cast a shadow on the face, and right here underneath the arm, and here lower part. Because the background makes it look like she's in a really sunny setting, so you do want to have some nice strong shadows. That sort of helps push the lighting. I'm adding just a little bit more purple, not a whole lot, but mostly here on the strings, since those didn't get quite a fair dose. And I noticed an area I didn't quite hit when I was, oh, that's going to be way too much. But I didn't quite hit when I was doing those initial washes. So I'm going to try to get in there really delicately. Alright, so I need to let that dry before I can work on the hair. Okay, so it seems that our paper has had a chance to dry. I'm going to go ahead and paint in her freckles now, and then I'm going to, or some of her freckles now, and then I'm going to darken up the color to better reflect her. Oh, no, I found a damp patch, but it shouldn't affect this. I'll darken up the hair color to better reflect her hair in the comic. And if you haven't had a chance yet, I highly recommend you go check out 7-Inch Kara, my comic, at 7, as in number or spelled out S-E-V-E-N, inch, INCHKARA.com. It's recently launched as a webcomic. But if you're like me and you like to binge read your comics, you don't want to have to wait for updates, you can get all of Volume 1. That is 74 pages of comic, so that would be 74 weeks. You can get all of Volume 1 from my shop at natosoup.com/Kara-comic. And 7-Inch Kara is a delightful all-ages watercolor comic. So if you have a young person in your life who enjoys reading or likes looking at, pretty pictures, you might want to show them the comic, and maybe they would enjoy it. All right, so I need to let this dry. But while I do that, I can go ahead and paint the interior of her mouth. And I like using a couple of different reds to do that. All right, now to let that dry. And I noticed an area where I would like to build more contrast is here on this arm. So I mixed up some more of the skin tone color, and I'm just going to go ahead and add another layer of that. Same with underneath the neck. Want that to be a harsher color transition. Over here on the arm as well. And then back up here underneath the bangs. And those who are watching my Watercolor Basics series know that watercolor is, at least for illustration purposes, and especially for comic purposes, there's often a give and take where you're sort of pushing and pulling color and you're adjusting this and you're modifying that until it looks just right. And sometimes it never looks just right and you have to move on for time constraint purposes. I'll knock in some of the darker purple right there where her arm would cast the shadow, and I'm being careful to leave a slight line there so that hopefully the two colors don't mix. And because I'm using cheap paper, I have some pooling, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to make my brush thirsty, which means we wash it and then we dry it off so it is damp but not wet, and that makes it a little more receptive to picking up the watercolor that might be a little too heavy on the page. Okay, so again, time to let this dry. All right, so our paint has had a chance to dry. I'm going to go ahead and mix up more Venetian red, but I'm also going to add, I think, some Van Dyke brown. And I mean, this is my character, so it doesn't really, the colors I'm mentioning, it doesn't really matter. And different brands are going to have different sort of takes on a color. So, you know, the Van Dyke brown I'm using, which is a Winsor & Newton Van Dyke brown, that might not even be the same Van Dyke brown that you have in your palette. That's okay. I'm mentioning these colors in case you see something I'm using and you're like, oh, that's nice. I wonder what colors she's using. And also just sort of force of habit from doing workshops and demonstrations. People usually want to know. And I'm trying to leave some of the white still visible. I say this in a lot of these watercolor tutorial videos, even though this is really supposed to be like an ink test. But I say that with watercolor, we always want to cover less than the layer before, and we always want to pull a little tighter than the layer before. And since this is kind of like a loose, fun little image, I am going to probably quit it with the hair after this layer. I usually do go a lot darker, but I really love how it looks like when you take a photo and the sun's sort of like blowing out the exposure. That's sort of how I think it's looking. Or if you see somebody and the sun's sort of blowing out the exposure, your eye's ability to adjust to light, sort of like that. Though I think I will add some shading to the skin, but just a little bit. I really don't want to over render it, especially because this paper is not a particularly heavy watercolor paper. It's already kind of struggling. And with these inexpensive papers, you will find that your color will start to slough off the page, and it's more prone to getting muddy. So you do want to keep kind of a lighter hand if possible. And I have some areas where I sort of went over the line. So I need to clean those up. Also, sometimes with these cheaper papers, your color can look a little grayer, a little less saturated than you know it is. And you can work thicker and compensate for that, or you can just kind of roll with it. And I think I'm just going to kind of roll with it for this one, because really we were testing Sailor Storia's ink capacity as, you know, for an artist quality ink that you would ink a piece with that you might watercolor. And it seems to hold up really well for that. I haven't had any problems with budging, any problems with, you know, color migration, which is great. Now, I did let it dry for 2 days, actually, before I started painting on it. I erased it after one day. I erased my pencil lines after one day, and then I got busy, and I didn't have time to come back and paint the way I'm doing now. So, right, adding some of those finer freckles. I kind of think of them as like little pepper specks in like milk. Like if you were making a gravy or something. It's the sort of freckles I have. I have the larger freckles, and then I have the really distinct smaller freckles. So when I do Kara, that's usually what I go with too. And I think having the layer of freckles is a little, it's a cute touch, and it's a little bit of believability, a little bit of reality without losing the cartooniness of the piece. So I need to allow her one eye and mouth to dry. And then I'm going to do just a little bit of shadow color, and then we can call this a video. Okay, so everything has had a chance to dry, and I am just going to go in a little bit with a little bit darker Van Dyke Brown. And I'm just going to push my hair behind my ear because it's always in the way. But also, I'm just going to, maybe not, try and darken just certain areas a little bit. And I'm going to have to do a little bit of cleanup. I'm having a hard time staying in the lines tonight. It's okay. Alright. And y'all remember how I showed you to clean up your watercolor messes. It's if you can even still notice them though. Sometimes they disappear or just not relevant. Alright, so Lastly, we need to do some shadow color. So I'm making another puddle. Unfortunately, I'm a little bit out of shot for that. And I'm taking a little bit of naphthol red and a little bit of mauve. I don't want anything too dark or too desaturated. Okay. And I'm going to start that here under the chin. And this is sort of a warm shadow color. It works really well for skin tones. Hopefully it'll dry as nice as it's going down, because it's a good color right now. And in the ear, and I'm gonna want to do the bangs, but I have a feeling they might reactivate. So I dab the excess paint out, and I'm just going to try to be really careful about getting that in there. And other than maybe some white highlights or maybe darkening things that dried a little lighter than intended, we're just about done. I would like to do a little bit of blush, so I'm just going to take a little bit of very watered down scarlet. Just going to add that there to the cheeks, underside of the nose, to the lips, and then I'll let everything dry, and I'm going to dab up a little bit of the shadow in the ears because it's a little extreme. Okay, so I'm going to let that dry and I'm going to check in, but I have a feeling we're pretty much done, and the only thing left is for white highlights. So for the purposes of saving time off camera, I went ahead and I darkened a couple of things, like the blush on her cheeks, and I added a little bit of that blush to her shoulders as well, to sort of push the whole out in the sun implication. And now I am just darkening the shadow cast by her bangs, and I'm going to darken this area as well and add a little bit of cast shadow with the ties on her dress. And I'm also going to go in and add a little bit of shadow on the ties again, because they're not quite as dark in some areas. There's not quite as much contrast as I would have liked. And I'm definitely going to add a little cast shadow on her dress there where it meets her shirt. So all that's left is to add some white. And I wish I had white fountain pen ink because I would demonstrate that. This would be a good opportunity to use it, but I don't yet. But I do have Copic Opaque White, which I talk about to you guys almost every video. It sees a lot of use. So I want to grab, I find that with the opaque white, synthetic brush works really well because it's a really stiff, water-soluble medium. Although I guess I'll use this super tiny Creative Mark instead. And the thing is, I have to be careful because I have a lot of wet areas. I don't want to cause any problems with those. So I'm gonna go into the teeth, add just a little bit of white, go into the eyes, tip of the nose, maybe add some really light flecks in the hair, but I don't want to cover up that yellow because that's working really well. And then, since this is a white dress, or it's supposed to be a white dress, now it's sort of more like a light blue. I'm just going to add a little bit of white highlight on top of the ink. All right, so I think we're done. So, what do I think about Sailor Storia pigmented inks? Specifically in Lion. I love it. I loved how it handled in my Noodler's Ahab. I love how the Noodler's Ahab handled on the Holbein watercolor sketchbook paper. And I love that adding layers of water really didn't reactivate this particular ink. I've noticed that with the Platinum Carbon Black, there is some reactivation. So I was hoping that with a color that was more of a skin tone, it wouldn't be noticeable if it did happen at all. And I didn't notice it at all. So that tells me that perhaps it's not even happening. Maybe it's not even an issue. I haven't done a field test yet for Dancer. I've been using Dancer, but it's in my Mnemosine Singularity, and it's a little prone to dripping. So probably when I've run through the Lion ink in my Ahab, I will refill it with the pigmented Dancer. But there are loads of beautiful colors available in Sailor Storia pigmented fountain pen inks. There's a really nice desaturated purple. There's a beautiful teal blue. I mean, there's some really, really nice colors. And hopefully over the years, I can add them to my collection and enjoy them. So if you're wondering where you can find Sailor Storia inks, I ordered mine on Amazon. I paid around $15 for Lion and $17 for Dancer. And you may also be able to find them on JetPens because I do believe that they carry Sailor products. Now, JetPens and I are not at all affiliated, so if you want to help me out, if you want to do this channel a solid, you can get your inks through Amazon using the affiliate link down below, and I'll see a few pennies from your purchase, which they all add up, they all help. So, thank you guys so much for watching the video. You can find a list of the materials used, at least the fountain pen materials used, in the description below. And if you're an artist who's interested in fountain pens, I highly recommend you check out the Noodler's Ahab and Sailor Storia inks. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, remember to leave a thumbs up. And if you have any questions, let me know in the comments below. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with me today, and I hope to see you again really soon. And remember, check out 7-inch Kara at 7inchkara.com. Bye, guys!